Hi, I've got a question for you. Doesn't religion cause violence? There's a book out by Rebecca McLaughlin called Confronting Christianity. It's subtitled 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. And this is Gary Zacharias, by the way, with the Apologist bookshelf. I've dealt with a couple of the past questions. She's got 12 questions there. And I've dealt with two of them in the past. One was, doesn't Christianity belittle women? And the other one was, aren't we better off without religion? So I'm going to pick one today. Doesn't religion cause violence? I think she does a really nice job dealing with that because we hear that a lot. She said in 1930, a famous British philosopher, Bertrand Russell, I bet you've heard his name before. He's used in a lot of different apologetics settings as an atheist. He said, religion prevents us from removing the fundamental causes of war. Religion prevents us from teaching the ethic of scientific cooperation in place of the old fierce doctrines of sin and punishment. It's possible that mankind is on the threshold of a golden age, but if so, it will first be necessary to slay the dragon that guards the door, and this dragon is religion. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? And she says, well, no wonder he said that. Just look around. She said people of every major religion have engaged in some horrifically violent acts, and often they've said that their God made them do it. She says, so maybe religion is the problem. If we just slay that dragon, then humans would lay down their swords. You know, of course, one of the things that comes up when you're talking about Christianity is the Crusades. And she said a lot of people will use the Crusades as a reason not to consider Christianity. She says, think about what Jesus said. He rejected violence. In Matthew 5, he talked about somebody slapping on one cheek, you turned to him the other cheek. And when people were going to come and arrest Jesus with swords, he rebuked them, and he healed one guy that was slashed with a sword. In Matthew 5, he says, love your enemies. So we now look at that, we say, how does all that square with the last 2,000 years of Christian history? The Crusades, what do we think of? We think of a violent, unprovoked imposition of Western religion on peaceful Eastern Muslims. Well, there's a problem with that, though. We don't understand. There was a huge misconception, at least the way we think of the Crusades today. There's a historian, Thomas Madden, he calls the Crusades one of the most misunderstood events in Western history. He said, popular thought today is dealing with myths that actually historians have long ago gotten rid of. You might take a look sometime. I've done a couple of podcasts by Rodney Stark dealing with the Crusades as well. So what's the idea? What's the mythology that's going around today that the Crusades were an unprovoked attempt by Western Christians to force their faith on peace-loving Eastern Muslims? They were just going about their business, and here come the Western Christians on horseback and on foot, clanking around in their armor and massacring them all. She says, but the truth is almost opposite. A historian, Robert Louis Wilkins, says this: the Crusades were a Christian counteroffensive against the occupation of lands that had been Christian for centuries before the arrival of Islam. So Christians, think about this, the Christian movement started with nonviolence. Right? The Christians didn't take over the cities by the sword, but Muhammad led the first Muslim armies, and they went out all across the world. They took over Palestine and Syria and Egypt. A lot of Christians there. They quickly succumbed. They conquered North Africa and Spain. In the 11th century, they conquered Asia Minor. They'd been Christian since the time of St. Paul. So around 1076, Turkish Muslims had taken over Jerusalem, and they started attacking pilgrims that were going there to worship. The city's patriarch was kidnapped. Holy places were desecrated. And so the Eastern Christians were calling for help. Pope Urban II was able to get a crusade together, and it did what it set out to do. It conquered Jerusalem. Oh, yes, but, and it's a huge problem, the loss of life was just horrific. Brutality, just terrible. Thousands were put to death. The violence along the way by the Crusaders against Jews. Now, one of the Crusades sacked Constantinople. That was the largest Christian city in the world. So she says, the last 2,000 years, we've seen Christians embroiled in violence against each other. So she says, no doubt about it. Some of the acts that was defending the vulnerable, okay, but there have been many acts of violence. But she said, maybe there's another religion that's more peaceful. Some people say, okay, but yeah, it's Christianity. That's pretty brutal, but they're better religions. She says, well, how about Buddhism? Said, most of us see that maybe as a more nonviolent kind of religion. She said, okay, but think about the violence against the Rohingya Muslims. That was in Buddhist majority Myanmar. And there's stories here of men and boys being executed in villages and babies being tossed into fires, beating and raping of women. Just awful. Something like 9,000 Rohingya, including 1,000 children, died. In 2018, New York Times had an article, Why Are We Surprised When Buddhists Are Violent? And that article said there's no shortage of historical examples of violence in Buddhist societies. How about Sri Lanka, Civil War from 1983 to 2009? It was Buddhist nationalism. Violence in modern Thailand. Violence within the Dalai Lama's own sect. And even the Buddhists were involved with Japanese nationalism in World War II. And she said, that she's not trying to say Buddhism is particularly violence-inducing. Millions of Buddhists do lead peaceful lives, but we're kidding ourselves if we think that Buddhism is a religion that's free of blood. There's been violence all over the place, led by Buddhists, especially against Muslims. She said, if you look at violent history of the human violent history, she said no major world religion comes out of it without blood on its hands. Even the Jews, think about right now what's going on there. A lot of violence that they're inflicting on others. So she says, well, all right, what about Jesus and what he did? He championed the poor and the oppressed and the Christians that come along. They invented hospitals, established welfare systems. They cared for the needy. Okay, so that sounds really good. But Karl Marx comes along in the mid-19th century, and he saw how far away from the biblical promise many of the Christian countries had fallen. And so he felt that Christianity was a drug, and it was trying to tranquilize people. So now he wants the real dream. Marx says we get rid of religion, especially Christianity, and the world will be a wonderful place. We'll have real happiness. Well, we know what that was like. The nightmare of communism, 61 million people killed in the former Soviet Union, 35 million in the People's Republic of China. Then you got North Korea, you've got Cambodia, you got Vietnam. And there's a political scientist, R.J. Rummel, who said, of all religions, secular and otherwise, that of Marxism has been by far the bloodiest. Okay, so she says, before we conclude that religion is the problem, she said, actually, if you look at a specifically anti-religious ideology, Marxism, communism, that's led millions to commit atrocious acts. And then she says, what about fascism? Right? She says, you can't really finish any talk about religion and violence unless you account for the Holocaust. She said, how is that in a country that supposedly had a lot of Christians, you end up having a Holocaust? Were the evils of Nazism, was that from Christianity? No. Hitler did not harness Christianity. In fact, according to the head of the Hitler Youth Movement, a man named Baldur von Schrock, the destruction of Christianity was explicitly recognized as a purpose for the National Socialist movement. So the Nazis changed the Bible. They called it positive Christianity. So they wanted to change Christianity. They were not Christians, but they took the idea of Christianity because they knew so many people believed in it, and they altered it, including the Bible. They rebranded Jesus as an Aryan. They got rid of any comments about his Jewish identity. They removed the Old Testament in their Bible. They edited the Gospels to get rid of any reference to Jesus as a Jew. They edited the text also. They replaced, oftentimes, it says, here's an example, the Sermon on the Mount. They got rid of that compassion for the weak and they made it militaristic. Can you imagine that? And then they taught the youth, Hitler youth, prayers that sounded like the Lord's Prayer, but is addressed to the Fuhrer. Here's an example. Adolf Hitler, you are a great Fuhrer. Thy name makes the enemy tremble. Thy Third Reich comes, thy will alone is law upon the earth. Let us hear daily the voice and order us by thy leadership, for we will obey to the end, and even with our lives. We praise thee. Hail Hitler. I mean, there was absolute worship going on there, but not Christianity, not because of Christianity. It's a new religion. It was a new Messiah and a new ideology. It was far from the Christian belief. Okay, so pretty sad about that. Hitler's science. What about this? If Hitler spawned a new religion for his racist ideology, he sought to justify it by science. Now remember, Bertrand Russell had said, religion is keeping us from teaching the ethic of scientific cooperation. In other words, if we got rid of religion and everything was run by science, life would be good. Yeah, but Hitler did that. He took science, at least what they thought of science back then. Now, for example, he argued in Mein Kampf, this is Hitler now, if nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one. Because in such a case, all our efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. So the Aryan race for him was superior, and you had to have racial purity. And so they're using evolution now as a scientific foundation. Now, that was used in communism and capitalism and Calvinism. But you could see for Hitler, the grasp of evolution is, well, if evolution depends on survival of the fittest, perhaps one race can claim to be more fit than others and can outcompete them. Exactly. So that was science. He used that as his ideology, his fascism. One of Hitler's influences was a German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, he saw that while God had been actually considered dead by the Enlightenment, Europe was still trading on Christian ethics, kindness and care for the common person and all. And he said this is Nietzsche, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. So if you give up your Christian faith, you got to get rid of the morality too. So he imagined somebody coming along who could rise above good and evil and throw off this slave morality. That's how he saw Christianity. Well, Hitler came along above good and evil, didn't he? He rejected the morality of weakness that Christianity had. It was too weak. You needed something stronger. So he had an idea of racial hierarchy. So she says, we've got to be a little cautious when people suggest replacing religion with science and expect we're going to get a better world. She said, science is not designed to give us morals. It can help us build chemical weapons and chemotherapy drugs, but it can't tell us whether and when to use them. I think that's a good point. She said, science cannot ground the belief that human beings should be valued equally. That's true. You can't put that in the test tube. She says, what about democracy? She said, maybe religion is just kind of irrelevant to the problem of violence. Maybe we just need liberal democracy. She said, yeah, it's brought us some good things, hasn't it? We go back to the Athenians back in Athens in the 5th century BC. Yeah, but that wasn't really a lot of democracy, pretty limited voting rights. Plato argued against democracy. He thought it was stupid to share power beyond gifted elites. But today, everybody says, oh, but democracy, that's a good thing. She says, well, it's so wonderful, yes, but how is it that we have democracy? She said, we forget Christianity's relationship with the spread of democracy. The biblical ethic of human equality, regardless of status, its insistence that leaders are servants, its realism about human nature, that's what's enabled countries to embrace the distribution of power that democracy represents. And she says our country is a case of that. Says the link between Christianity and democracy is evident even beyond the West. She gives an example from political scientist Robert Woodbury. He has shown that the historic prevalence of Protestant missionaries, they were sent all over the world. She said, this man says, this explains about half the variation in democracy in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. So that's why there's so much democracy around the world, thanks to Protestant missionaries. She said also, we forget when we think liberal democracy is the natural form of government, is how it doesn't tie in. It's not compatible with Islam. So Islam has a political structure, but it's not democratic. She says, as an example, in 2017, only 6 of the 57 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation were deemed democracies. So can you see what's going on here? Just because you set up your government, it really depends what's your background, your religious background. Getting rid of religion doesn't get you anything. So you've got an Islamic religion that actually kills off democracy. She said democracy doesn't just happen, and its spread is not inevitable. So she says democracy has to be, she calls it being nested in the right philosophical foundations. So she said, if we're hoping for democracy, then we ought to hope for the spread of Christianity. That may be our best hope. So she said, yeah, we have had a failure in the Christian world. We had the Crusades. We had German pastors who supported Hitler. America ended up embracing slavery. So there have been some terrible Christian disasters over the years. And she said, well, why is it then for the failure of these supposed Christian countries to live up to Jesus' teaching? And she said, she thinks there are 2 reasons. One, we can't assume that everyone who identifies as a Christian really is authentically one. And she gives an example. Jesus says at the final judgment, some people are going to be surprised by their condemnation. And she says, secondly, the Bible teaches us to expect moral failure. We're not naturally good people who've just been deprived by our bad parents or bad money. We're innately sinners. That's what Christianity says. We veer towards selfishness all the time. She said, I see that in my own heart. So those 2 things may be the reason why Christianity has failed in many cases. But she says, if you go to what she calls the central violence of the Christian faith, she said, look at the center, at the heart of Christianity, extreme violence. An innocent man is tortured and executed. She said Christians believe that this execution was orchestrated by God himself. Some argue from this that Christianity glorifies violence. She says, no, it's just the opposite. Violence is the use of power by the strong to hurt the weak. But she said, at the cross, the most powerful man who ever lived submitted to the most brutal death ever died to save the powerless. Christianity does not glorify violence. It humiliates it. She said, so think about this. What's our most fundamental problem? It's not the lack of education or democracy or opportunity, but this terrible thing the Bible calls sin. And she says the strange claim of Jesus' resurrection offers us hope that evil is not going to be ultimately triumphant, and that anyone who gives up his or her life to follow Christ will find it. She said that motivates action. It motivated Christians in the 4th century to take care of the sick and take care of the poor. It motivated Martin Luther King to advocate nonviolence resistance. It motivates Christians today, she said, to sacrifice themselves all around the world. Nicholas Kristof, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and human rights activist. He says this, go to the front lines at home or abroad in the battles against hunger, malaria, prison rape, obstetric fistula, human trafficking, or genocide. And some of the bravest people you meet are evangelical Christians who truly live their faith. So she says at the end of the chapter, does religion cause violence? It can. But millions of people are driven by their Christian faith to love and serve others. She said Christianity has served, in a sense, as a fertilizer for democracy. It's a motivation for justice, and it's a mandate for healing. She said if we think the world would be less violent without it, we may need to check our facts. So that's quite a challenge. So I think you might enjoy this book. It discusses 12 really good questions and answers them about people that are critics of Christianity. Wonderful book. Thank you for being part of the podcast today. See you later.